Recently, I did a video which looked at Nintendo's rationale for $80 games. As you can imagine, given the topic, it evoked some strong feelings. Nobody wants to face price hikes and to make tough choices about their game purchases. For today, though, I wanted to do a response to 10 specific questions or criticisms related to the $80 price tag and to explore what is going on with Nintendo. I've tried to sort these into practical considerations first and then the more philosophical issues later on. On the topic of whether the console will fail because the cost is high and people's buying power has not managed to keep pace with inflation, I've got a separate video coming up on how they may manage that. I'm also looking into other videos on the price of video games, which may be more research intensive and so will probably take a little while longer. And for those querying game keys, I recommend John Linneman's recent assessment on Digital Foundry, which I found very interesting. I may come back to these in another video, as I currently don't have a firm view one way or the other on the strengths or weaknesses of the game key approach. The most common topic, of course, was on wages and the fact that wages have not kept pace with inflation. But this is a Nintendo channel which sometimes deep dives the company's surprisingly varied history with knitting games and is not a channel on macroeconomics except insofar as it's adjacent to Nintendo-related concerns. You can draw your own conclusion about the merits or demerits of Nintendo's choices, but I think it's interesting to assess why they appear to have been made. For this video, I have taken aggregations of comments rather than any individual response. I am sorry I can't shout out individual comments, many of which were excellent and insightful, but it would take too long to trawl back through all the messages, so instead I'm summarising the 10 best and most common questions, criticisms, or observations. All that said, let's get into it. Okay then, let's start with the fairly quick ones and progress to the meatier topics. Number 1. European prices. This argument stems from the fact that while I covered prices denominated in US currency, the sticker price for games in Europe appears to be even steeper, €90 for some titles, despite the fact that if you just go with a simple exchange rate, an $80 title should convert to about €73. This does have a relatively straightforward explanation, which is that different countries levy sales taxation differently. In America, sales taxes are added at the point of sale, but they are not advertised in the sticker price, whereas most European territories have the price on the label reflect the full charge of the product. You don't have to do mental maths as you get to the till. Adjusted for value-added tax, sales tax, or other equivalents, I have not seen a dramatic difference in the prices between Switch 2 models internationally, although I would welcome examples if they exist. Number 2. Games are more expensive now because they're incomplete without DLC. I've seen a few people argue this, but I have to say I am very skeptical, and actually I suspect that the exact opposite may be true. I'm really struggling to think of an example of paid DLC where I've thought, man, this experience was so flimsy before, but now it's complete. Base Breath of the Wild, Fire Emblem, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, and so on, these are very fully featured games in their own right. Now, it's true that DLC is added on, but you essentially pay for the content or you don't. Actually, my suspicion is that base game prices are kept lower because DLC profits are factored in. Something like the Breath of the Wild DLC to me is fun, but clearly isn't another 33% of content on top of the base game as the price would indicate. I mean, it's not even a question. The add-ons are fun, but they're not that expansive. And since DLC rarely is found in physical editions, remember that DLC is of higher value to Nintendo because they can sell it digitally with a higher margin. But DLC is for those who really love the game and want more from it, and so arguably, it's fair enough for those most passionate enjoyers of a game to pay a bit more to offset the upfront costs. I think DLC has also been a broadly positive innovation to avoid reissuing games just to add on extra amounts of content. The Pokemon series routinely did this, with the most recent example being 2017's Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, while there are examples of Nintendo releasing new versions of games even where the originals are playable with backward compatibility. Twilight Princess HD on Wii U and Mario and Luigi Bowser's Inside Story on 3DS being two examples that spring to mind. Since Sword and Shield, DLC expansions for Pokemon have become the standard means of expanding the content offer, and I think that's broadly a good thing. Number 3. Nintendo fans are paying to subsidize Nintendo's other commercial ventures, such as the theme parks and films. Which I guess is technically true, but these are generally turning out to be hugely profitable. Businesses will always take risks and incur expenses as they attempt to innovate, but in aggregate, these experiments should work out. I don't know how profitable Labo was, but Ring Fit Adventure certainly made its money back. Number 4. Nintendo underpays its employees. This is an interesting one, and there have been reports of shoddy treatment of subcontractors. I'm just not sure there's any evidence that the employees themselves are not remunerated very well, though. In January, it was reported that for the fiscal year ending March 2024, Nintendo's average annual salary was the highest in its region of Japan and far above any other software developers on this list. But then again, it also has people staying for a long time, which naturally biases the numbers as you would have more high-wage people. My general expectation is that Nintendo tries to hire great people and keep them at the company for a long time, so I would expect their pay to be pretty high by industry standards. But it might be something I try to deep dive at some point, and if anybody has any useful insight, please do let me know. Number 5. Games in the 90s were double the price, but people could afford them better. And this is partly true. It's not that wages were higher, actually wages are higher now in an American context, but that key costs like housing especially were significantly lower. But as with today, these were not felt equally, and by any measure, $160 for a game is still an eye-watering sum. But the market was clearly well adapted to this, with rental stores being common and people sharing games a lot too. Clearly, with GameShare and with the ability to stream out games to other consoles, Nintendo have already anticipated this kind of move. I will return to their broader mitigation measures in a fuller video. Okay, let's progress to some of the discussion points which are a bit more complex. Number 6. The games do not represent sufficient value. Variants of this include the graphics aren't as good as PlayStation 5, so they should charge less, and that games are less cutting edge or content rich now. I can see the logic of this perspective, but it assumes that the metric most deserving of value in the game is the graphics, whereas I would feel it's the gameplay. Take something like Tears of the Kingdom. Like it or loathe it, the Ultra Hand and fusion mechanics were clearly where the vast bulk of the development effort was spent. The graphics reused heavily content from Breath of the Wild. Don't get me wrong, they look great on Switch, and there were some technical feats, such as allowing you to cross seamlessly between the sky, land, and depths. But I think it's the key game mechanics that drove the gameplay. A whole game built around smashing things, Donkey Kong Bonanza, or a game where you can stitch together objects at will, Tears of the Kingdom, are major attempts to create a new gameplay experience that has never been pulled off before. This is something Nintendo at least attempts routinely, even within its established franchises. For me, with a Nintendo game, this is what you're paying for the time of the creators to think, experiment, innovate, and perfect. Now, you may think it's just not worth the money, of course, and I'm sure we can all list a dozen or more games just off the top of our heads which did not turn out to be that impressive. In the main, though, I think the value of a Nintendo game is felt in the experience of play rather than observed on the television screen. Alongside this, the Switch era has seen some of the most fully featured games in the history of their respective series. Previous Zelda games have taken me dozens upon dozens of hours to complete one playthrough and finish exploring to my satisfaction, but Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom took me hundreds of hours. Less subjectively, the worlds are far more vast, the ranges of subquests more numerate, even if you might have particular views one way or the other about their quality. But look, even if you think Switch 2 games do not represent value, even if you look at the luscious open skies of Mario Kart World and say, hey, not for me, that is literally how prices work. A company sets its price, the marketplace responds. If people don't like it, they won't buy it. I would suggest that one reason people did stick with the Switch despite its prices being relatively high early on is that they did see the clear value being presented. Which leads me neatly on to number 7. If you drop the price, more people will buy it and everyone will be happy. This does seem perfectly reasonable. After all, 50 million people buying your game for a cheaper price is surely going to be better than 5 million people buying your game for a more expensive price. Also, while Nintendo has certain fixed costs which are quite substantial, as we've seen with digital especially, extra sales are pure gravy for them, so they should want to try to lower the price and boost the audience as much as possible. Logically, of course, there are limits to this strategy. If you drop Pikmin 4 from $60 to $6, a tenfold increase would 10 times as many people buy it, giving it numbers roughly on par with Animal Crossing New Horizons and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Clearly, that is not the case. Nintendo would simply lose money. The technical term for this is that the good is demand inelastic, i.e., just because the price stretches and squeezes does not mean that the demand shows the same elasticity. In fact, demand tends to be relatively stable for video games, or at least for Nintendo games. If you're a Pikmin fan, you might reach a point where you're priced out, but until that point is reached, most people are likely to want to buy the new Pikmin. And we can see a prime example of this in Metroid Prime Remastered. That game retailed for $40, despite the fact that it was far more lavish in its presentation than a good number of $60 remasters of games with less critical acclaim. Surely then, dropping a third off the price bolstered sales by at least a third. Well, we don't have definitive numbers on Metroid Prime Remastered, and because it released at the end of a financial year, we only know it had 1.09 million in its first few weeks, a couple of 100,000 more in the quarter following, but clearly it didn't reach 1 million in the next financial year, or it would have hit the reporting threshold of 1 million units. Maybe it's by now at 2 million. If there's a massive surge from the price drop, though, I am not seeing it. And perhaps this is especially true for Nintendo products, which, after all, hold their value even years down the line. Nintendo doesn't drop its prices because the demand still holds up, but the reverse is often true. With regular sales opportunities, they have plenty of times to test which franchises are responsive on price, and it appears that most people will shell out a larger amount for Nintendo games. Number 8. American digital prices aren't lower even though Nintendo is making more money per product on a digital sale. And it does appear to be the case that while in other regions Nintendo is offering digital products at a discount roughly equivalent to $10, the American prices are remaining the same. This is an interesting one, and I don't have any definite answer. The game cards are higher in storage and appear to be more expensive, so the logic for Tears of the Kingdom's price, for example, was the more expensive game card, and it does appear that their pricing logic includes a $10 uplift for Switch 2 just for the game card. If you value physical collection, then it makes some sense to reflect the greater storage cost compared to digital in the price for the physical games. It's also something that they do have the headroom to offer. If a $60 game from 2017 is now $80 in real terms, they only reflect half the inflationary increase in the price and make up the difference by funneling more people towards digital, where the margins are higher, while keeping the charge in place for the game card for the physical media. This seems like a reasonable strategy that tries to shield consumers from the full impact of the costs. So why does it not appear to be the case in the USA? Obviously, I can only speculate, but a couple of possibilities occur to me. Firstly, the US has many more large chains who may have balked at the idea of differential pricing, which could damage their ability to shift physical games, and so this may have been the subject of a negotiation. Secondly, Nintendo may have decided to keep digital prices consistent as a hedge against the imposition of tariffs on games in the American market. It's a lot easier to announce a price drop or a deal later on if tariff costs are not imposed than to have a second price hike just after the third one went down like a cup of cold sick, and because the digital and physical differentiation isn't something American consumers are used to, so nobody's really missing it anyway. Also, though, some European regions are far more digital friendly, with the UK reportedly owning 90% of its games digitally. In countries where more is invested in digital media, they can offset other costs more readily because they're making much higher margins on the games. Now, how much does Nintendo actually make off digital products compared to physical? Well, with physical, they have to wear a retailer cut of maybe a third of the recommended price, manufacturing, shipping costs, and to account for storage and other issues. So they keep maybe 55, 60, top whack 65% of the game revenue. It's hard to know without having the wholesale numbers, although I could believe it's toward the higher end. After all, unlike other publishers, Nintendo goes to great lengths to preserve its prices, and so they can make the case to retailers that even if they have a smaller percentage, they're getting a cut of a larger pie. Returns don't appear to be an issue for Nintendo, so I have not accounted for them here. Digital has some overheads for server maintenance and storage, but this dissipates across potentially millions of sales, so they basically keep the income directly. Also, their reward points is effectively a 5% discount on digital if claimed, and because it's done automatically, I guess they usually are claimed, unlike the 1% bonus points for physical games, which are not all that widely communicated. Also, unlike with retail games, any sales or deals come off their price, and it's actually not uncommon to see digital discounts of 10% up to sometimes 33% on occasion. It's hard to say how many people do buy at a discount. Most people buy games early, and early prices won't be discounted, but I guess of those who buy later, most would buy during a sale. You can do your own back of an envelope calculation on this, but I'm going to assume it averages out at a 5% loss for Nintendo, meaning that they're probably keeping 90% of the digital sale price most of the time. I would estimate, therefore, that the difference between their revenue on physical games versus digital is about a quarter to a third of the price of a game, or around $20. By eating half of the inflation costs in non-American regions, around $10, they have probably halved the profitability of digital, but kept its slight advantage to them. You can draw your own conclusions as to whether digital prices should effectively subsidize physical, or whether digital should be significantly cheaper, given that it is more profitable for Nintendo. Number 9. Nintendo should have increased prices incrementally in order to avoid shocking its customers. Now, this does make some kind of sense, but I have very mixed feelings on this one. There is a particular ratio that supermarkets use often, which is basically a price increase so small as to be basically imperceptible, which, used often enough, will lead to bigger prices without causing a market response. It's the same as the commonly used, though rather cruel, boiling frog analogy. That is, if you put a frog into boiling water, it would jump out, but if you boil the water with the frog in it, it will die. Even assuming that this were possible to enact without it really being noticed, I'm talking about the game increases, this is not the frog, is it ethical? To me, buying into a system, especially a pricey one like the Switch 2 is going to be, is in some respects an act of faith on the part of the consumer. You expect it to continue to have game support, and I think it's reasonable to expect that the games are not going to rocket up in price. There have always been times when games, for whatever reason, have become pricier mid-generation because of specific technologies. The game card stores more, for example, or there's the example of Virtua Racer on the Mega Drive, which contained a chip in the cartridge to help get it closer to the arcade experience. But Nintendo only did this once in the Switch generation with Tears of the Kingdom, in their words, because of the size of the cartridge required and the costs that this incurred. Now, you might disbelieve this assertion, but what is not in dispute is that the overwhelming majority of Switch titles have maintained their same pricing structure into the console's 9th year on the market. They did eat up all the costs associated with inflation, and if the Switch 2 lasts 8, 9, 10 years, then there is a strong likelihood that Nintendo's plan A would be to fix these costs as well, unless market conditions are really, really dreadful. If you think $80 is going to seem high by comparison to the rest of the market by the end of the Switch 2's life, I've got a Switch Pro to sell you. Nintendo has dabbled in what I would consider quite predatory pricing moves before, notably in games like Mario Kart Tour with microtransaction models that utilize so-called whales, customers who, whether out of love for the franchise or just an inherently addictive personality, pay vastly over the odds to subsidize everyone else. But generally, Nintendo reject this approach. They made Super Mario Run a paid game when people were up in arms about paying for a mobile title, but I think they were absolutely right morally to say that they would have one transparent transaction and no more. With the exception of a few microtransaction options on games like Smash, where full DLC passes are available anyway, I cannot think of an example on Switch from Nintendo directly of a time when they've gone down this microtransaction route. So yes, absolutely, if they end up with nearly decade-long console lifespans and don't adjust, the snapback at the end will be dramatic. But as Nintendo saves from reduced costs as time goes by, since older games don't need making all over again, the customer shares the benefit in real terms price cuts. Then, favouring maximum transparency, they whack up the price for the new generation. The truth is, you're paying one way or the other. Your mileage may vary, but I prefer Nintendo's model. Number 10. Nintendo is bigger now and has deeper pockets. This is partly true, but I also find it a bit misleading. This decade, Nintendo has done incredibly well, lifted up on the back of the Switch's success in the COVID era, the greater move to digital, and most especially the benign exchange rate conditions that make international sales worth far more in Japanese yen. To some extent, this success is self-made, but to a large degree as well, it's been an element of luck. But these days won't last forever. 10 years ago, Nintendo was on the brink of making severe cutbacks and avoided it at least for its core teams through careful forward planning. But in those days, people were seriously talking about Nintendo doing a Sega and bailing out of console manufacturing. It's far from impossible that with a few bad moves, those times could come back round again, and so it makes sense that they are very cautious about using a temporary gain simply to mitigate inevitable price rises which would eat into their margins long term and potentially damage their profitability. Of course, if you're interested in how Nintendo uses its cash on hand, you may want to check out this video on screen. Meantime, thanks as ever for watching, commenting and subscribing, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.